Good afternoon. I'm here to talk to you today about the third of our fourth week on the Ten Commandments. And I've got props today. I've got a tape measure and a ladder. I think these two things represent how many of us usually see the Ten Commandments. So first, the tape measure. I think we often think of the Ten Commandments as kind of a moral measuring stick. If we go to church, if we love our parents, if we don't lie and we don't steal, that measuring tape gets longer and longer. But we all know we're human, and that happens. Then there's the ladder. Works a little similarly, but a little different approach. So, if we go to church, if we don't lie, if we don't steal, the higher up on the ladder we get, and the closer to God that we get. But again, we're human and we're going to blow it and we fall off that ladder. I think these are very common understandings because we live in a very individualistic culture, and these are individualized ways to think about the commandments. So that's pretty normal. But that's not what the commandments are about. Remember, we're looking back at the commandments through our Matthew reading. The greatest commandment is to love God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and to love your neighbor as yourself. The Ten Commandments are about love, and they are not about us. They are about God, and they are about our neighbor. And remember that the Ten Commandments were given to the Israelites as a whole people, as a nation. And they're given to them because they are a free people now. They have been brought out of Egypt, out of slavery, and they have to learn to live again as God's holy people. And so the commandments answer the question, how do I love God and how do I love my neighbor? Now, this particular part of Exodus is not the only place where the Ten Commandments are explicitly talked about. They're talked about later in Exodus, and they're talked about in Deuteronomy. They're also referred to and expanded upon in many other places in the Old Testament. And so we get an understanding that truly loving our neighbor is not so much about the negative acts that we don't do, but it's also, and more importantly, about the more positive acts and the positive regard that we have for our neighbors, the way that we actively love. And one of the people who's done, I think, the best job with unpacking that is Martin Luther, our person that the Lutheran Church is named for and that brought about the Reformation 500 years ago. What he has to say is still relevant for us today. So very quickly, I'm just going to go through the commandments we're looking at today and talk a little bit about how Martin Luther addressed what we don't do and what we do with these commandments. So first of all, honor your father and mother. We don't despise in anger. We do honor, serve, and obey and hold our parents in love and esteem. You shall not murder. Don't hurt or harm your neighbor, but do help and befriend your neighbor. Do not commit adultery. The don't there is pretty self-explanatory, but do honor and love your spouse. In this case, your spouse is your neighbor. You shall not steal. Don't take money or property, or don't deal falsely with your neighbor. Don't con them out of something. But do improve and protect their means and their property, and improve your neighbor's conditions that they live in. And finally, you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. Don't lie, betray, slander, or defame, but do defend your neighbor, speak well of your neighbor. And what I think is a tough one in this day and age and in our current culture is put the best construction on what your neighbor says and does. These are great words of wisdom from Martin Luther and how he looks at the Ten Commandments and answers the question for us, how do we love our neighbor? And now we today are a free people as well. Jesus died and rose again so that we could be free from sin and from death. And so we are free to love God and love our neighbor. And so the 10 Commandments are still applicable to us today. Thanks and have a great afternoon.